I have. So welcome everybody to our final ATARCA workshop. And this is just to remind us of our patron, the EU, who was so generous to give us this 2.75 million euro grant. And there's the information to credit the EU. And then I am the co-PI of ATARCA, working alongside Villa Eloranta, who's the PI. So I was really grateful to all the work that we've done before, because I'm drawing on the slides that we've put together from the mid-year review. And I'm going to be giving a brief statement of what we have, our intellectual mission and the research that we've achieved integrated into actual field pilot experiments. That means that we have, of course, business partners, and we are not just your normal academic research project with books. As you can see, my bookshelves behind me. Before ATARCA, I was just doing research, and now I'm pleased to be working in the field. So when we applied for the ATARCA grant, there is an entire, well, we promised a lot. We promised that we would open up a new type of means of having economics of anti-rival goods. And we concentrated initially about thinking about the role that the digital media play in terms of making goods that can be reproduced and produced over and over again at very little cost. So this grant was inspired by the view or the research question of how can we create some kind of a currency system using distributed ledger technology and blockchain so that we could handle these anti-rival value flows. So we are trying to figure out how we can have this alternative currency, and that how that currency can create a means to continue to grow value as the resource that we have increases, rather than having scarce resources that we're very familiar with in standard economics. So the primary concept that we're working with is to create a currency that can grow itself as the medium that it's helping to proliferate also grows, to try to encapsulate what we're doing in simple terms. Throughout, I would say this one table has been maybe saying, well, a founding document for sure. And when we look at the fourfold classification scheme of excludable, non-excludable, rival, and non-rival, that was charted territory for economics. But we're looking at anti-rival type of goods, so network goods and symbiotic goods, many of which are digital. But as I've argued in part of our research project, the food futures part, that this could also be anti-rival goods that are positive externalities, such as living sustainably in harmony with the planet together. Okay, so that was what we set out to do, knowing that we have significant challenges because contemporary markets work on the idea that anything that has value must be scarce by definition, and so that it would be an oxymoron or a paradox to have a good that's valuable and is not scarce. So we're up against the economic mainstream, and we are trying to operate in a way that we're both generating new theory at the same time that we're also generating practices where we can conduct experiments, collect data, and have a quantitative and also qualitative means of defending that we're able to proliferate this anti-rival value. So we know we have big challenges. And we also know, of course, that human civilization would have never been able to get this far if it didn't have its inherent means to promote anti-rival value. And what are examples of this? Anytime that a knowledge base increases, like sometime along in the early prehistoric history of humankind, when we learned how to create fire, that knowledge was had additional value every time one new set of individuals in another community learned how to create fire. So we know in terms of knowledge and open access policies, we also know in terms of trust, there are many times and many examples when we have had anti-rival value and it's been fundamental to the development of human civilization. However, we also know that for most of human history, prehistory, communities were relatively small. And so that now as we try to move into a global planetary economy with 9 billion people, we're at 9, right? We crossed that line, I think. 9 billion people, that we need solutions that are way beyond those that would have been sufficient for sharing knowledge in earlier times. So as I'm progressing here with the slides, I'm now going to turn the page from the intellectual background of our project to looking at what we are actually doing in practice to meet these challenges. So we're designing experimental economic systems, and we are identifying specific anti-rival resources that the experimental setting using the DLT and blockchain technology with tokens will actually be able to demonstrate that we've achieved this. So that's what we're trying to do. And then we are therefore in the domain of designing new institutions. And I think all of our pilot use cases in Barcelona, the streamer case in Switzerland, and then also here at Food Futures in Helsinki, Finland, we are well aware that we're creating new types of institutions and new kinds of anti-rival incentives, and that this is not done in a vacuum. At least Food Futures in specific is using Elinor Ostrom's theoretical approach, but we're not just even staying with the institutional design that's been presented to us, because at best that was non-rival, and we're moving in the anti-rival territory. So Food Futures in specific, and I think the other cases too, have found a way to use this vocabulary. We're proliferating positive externalities. These are actions or contributions we make that have a benefit outside of the partners in exchange, and the externalities we're studying are anti-rival. And we want to capture that value of the anti-rival positive externalities and find a way for them to proliferate. So this is my favorite set, and I'm not going to go into it in depth, but to think a little bit about our practice. And we here then turn the page to our pilot experiments. This is a bit of a banner headline for those of you who are here, or maybe hear the recording, to tune into our other talks, because tomorrow we'll be going into all of the pilot use cases. So I'm not going to go into these in too much depth. Here is probably one of my favorite ATARCA slides that we developed all together, because I think this was created by Claire originally. That was an infogram for Twitter, I believe. But in any case, this one slide does an excellent job to put all of our pilot use cases on the table. And I'm not going to bother reading through these because they will be discussed in detail tomorrow. But one thing that we all share, all of the different use cases share the idea that we're going to use blockchain or these cryptocurrency tokens as a medium of sharing. What that means is that every time that value is increased, the tokens are not exchanged, deleted from one account, and then added to another account. Instead, the tokens actually multiply in the same way then that the value that they're tracking multiplies. So that we have then come up with this term of the trade, SNFTs, which then, if you're following ATARCA at all, you know that's shareable, non-fungible tokens that add to the, what we're trying to do then is position ourselves that maybe the NFT craze crashed and burned, as we know, along with the idea that we can have speculative cryptocurrencies that will be endlessly growing in value. But we have a totally different approach here, that we're using shareable, non-fungible tokens that have an entirely different function. They're mediums of sharing to capture positive externalities. So I think in a way I don't need to go through the details on this slide because it might end up being a little bit repetitive. I think I'll be able to come in right on time to finish with this sort of food for thought slide or food print token slide with my research team, the Food Futures team that will be presenting tomorrow together with me. We wanted to develop an actual look and feel to our digital cryptocurrency. And so this is what our design team came up with to represent the food print token so that maybe it would seem less virtual and a little bit more tangible and concrete. So with that, I am going to now introduce our first keynote. I'll stop sharing since I don't need that function anymore. And we've had a little bit of I don't know what your original view of the program was, but our first speaker is Arthur Brock, and he is speaking to us instead of Matthew Schutte. Matthew Schutte is with us. Or he's still here. He's boarding a flight or on a flight, one or the other. And there's Matthew saying hi to everyone. He's on our board of advisors, the official ATARCA board of advisors, helping us stay up to our obligations for the EU and providing oversight. And in his place then is going to be Arthur Brock, who is a co-founder of Holochain. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him. Arthur Brock designs targeted currencies which shape flows of information, participation, and resources, and builds the peer-to-peer technology infrastructure to ensure they remain unenclosable. So that would mean they cannot be subject to centralized control or corruption. And then Arthur has founded many mind-bending projects, Holochain, Scepter, and Agile Learning. And then here's why we're really excited that Arthur is with us today. His work focuses on the critical role that incentives, feedback loops, and currencies play in successful and regenerative organizations. Arthur's latest projects, Holochain and Holo, are about scaling those patterns. Holochain is a massively scalable, inexpensive, and post-blockchain framework for writing distributed apps, which are called the apps. Holo is a flagship project and is currently in a new mode. I know you guys told me exactly what Matthew, you're with me. What is the new mode that you started in January called? I'm not getting the chime in.
We had a beta release of the Holochain platform.
There we go, beta release. Up and running now, apparently totally functional. So now with that, I'm going to turn over the floor to Arthur, and you're so welcome to be here with us today, and we're really excited and to hear your talk.
Thank you, Sonia. Yes, and Matthew and I worked on this talk yesterday, and didn't have necessarily quite all the context that you just gave. I hope it fits in well. I'm going to share screen. Do I have permission for that? Looks like I do. All right. Can people see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Just one note, I come from a weird background of currencies that you can find out more about at metacurrency.org. But part of what I'm trying to do is kind of, in English, we have this great etymology for the word we use for money oftentimes, right, in terms of currency. So I'm actually trying to reclaim that word to mean a little bit more than just money, just the kind of medium of exchange, rivalrous tokens that we're used to using. And so you can think, when I use the word currency, you can kind of think of it this way too, like currency, the symbol systems we create to shape, enable, and measure flows. Like we need better collective intelligence around managing these flows. So let's drill into that. Some of you may be familiar with the book Freakonomics. I want to steal an example from that book at the moment about a daycare center in Haifa, Israel, that was having problems with their parents picking up kids late from after school or after the program. I think the program ended somewhat midday, and they didn't really have aftercare for that program, and so they have kids with their teachers standing out in the hot sun waiting to be picked up. And they sort of turned it into an opportunity for an economic study. And they measured the frequency with which the problem was occurring. And then they put in place an economic incentive, a fine for picking your kids up late. And what do you think happened? I mean, obviously they were thinking you put in place an economic incentive to alter behavior. And anyway, the problem tripled. And they seemed very surprised by this. And part of what I want to touch on here is often actually the unintended consequences that thinking only in terms of economic incentives can create when we fail to recognize kind of the full range of human motivation and why it is that we do things, and the kinds of currencies that can play at these different in these different ranges. So first, I'm suggesting that there's different motivational layers for why humans do what they do, and that they're always in place simultaneously. There's like a learning layer, kind of a fun and pleasure layer, and a survive and thrive layer. And we're going to really be looking at the survive and thrive layer here. And there's some basic dimensions in play. And here, the images, the Zoom videos may be in the way of seeing this. I'm actually also borrowing from Ken Wilber's integral quadrants as a metaphor here, where we have kind of the individual level above and collective below, and internal to the left, external to the right. And we tend to focus on the economic imperative, which I would assert uses rational numbers and is focused on things that are tradable. It's about those individual external needs, it's kind of those physical needs being met. But there's also kind of a tribal imperative about how do we help each other meet collective needs. We're much more successful together than we are alone, right? And so if you think about it in the daycare center example, it is like the parents they want to treat well the people who take care of their kids, right? We're taking care of each other, so you want to treat each other well. And then there's the social imperative. And oh, sorry, I forgot to mention the type of measurement here. And again, these are sort of borrowing from Stevens' different types of measurement in the social sciences in terms of rational, interval, ordinal, nominal. But I'm suggesting they actually apply to these different domains, and they can be different metrics, and currencies can be formalized in these different ways. So here we actually have ordinal, or sort of ranking of numbers here. And this is kind of where the social imperative comes into play, and the wanting to look good. You don't want to look like a bad or irresponsible parent by picking your kids up late and that kind of thing. And there's also the moral imperative, how you want to relate to yourself. You want to know yourself in the world, and you want to think of yourself as a good parent and as responsible and as timely. And this has to do with that internal individual dimensions, right? So the thing is, in this example of the daycare center, is virtually impossible to put a reasonable fine in place that is more compelling than these other pressures were. And culturally, we have a norm of when you create an economic cost to something, it basically forgives people their responsibilities in these other domains. It replaces that responsibility. And so sometimes when we put economic systems in place, we are actually damaging some of the already existing social fabric that has these other things in place. So one of the things that I would note when putting in place, like some of the experiments that you're doing, like with the food futures index and all of that, when putting those things in place, you have to also make sure you step outside of the kind of rational tradable numbers, which those, the metrics that sort of expand out from the center is an example of that, right? Of being able to make things visible in some of these other dimensions. So let's jump ahead to expanding this out just a little bit further. So in this survive and thrive layer, there's more than just the collective, there's also an interpersonal layer. And, where you want to see your effect on other humans and in relationship with other humans. And you want to be able to see your ability to contribute to others and to be seen and appreciated by others. So this actually kind of spells out how you might summarize the different impacts in these dimensions. And what's interesting is you really can formalize currencies that really end up operating in and resonating with people in this dimension. And I want to just give some examples here. This was a project that was advertised a lot in the United States. I'm not exactly sure how much it was visible elsewhere, but they had these commercials. The Christian Children's Fund had these commercials that basically were saying, and essentially every nonprofit is making this kind of appeal. They're basically saying, forego a little bit of economic responsibility or benefit for being able to trade off in these other domains. And that the way they framed that, and this was before the days of Starbucks and $5 cups of coffees, they were saying, for the price of a cup of coffee a month, no, a day, sorry, for the price of a cup of coffee a day, you can feed a starving child in Africa. And then they would go on to tell you about the ways that you would receive updates on the contribution that you were making for that child. And basically using language to expand the sense of tribe and family to taking care of children all over the world. And they would give you a picture frame and send you a picture of the child that you could put on your mantle or on your table, and sort of be able to share this and increase your social status with, this is the child that I'm taking care of in Africa. And then you'd receive letters from the child that help them write, so that you'd experience that direct appreciation. And the whole advertisement was basically coded in this kind of moral language to be able to recognize yourself as a better person for doing this. And this is a pretty common frame, and these motivations exist, and they're not automatically trumped by the economic imperative. Sometimes you don't need to pay somebody to do something, reward them with tradable goods, when you can provide enough reward in these other domains. In fact, they will often forego some economic benefit when they see these rewards in other dimensions. And one of the things that I would say we actually see today in the realm of what I would call currencies are a bunch of these kind of certification systems. Actually, want to diverge for a moment, use the example of food, not the Food Futures Index, but just food in general. There was a time when it was just food. It wasn't necessarily things like, locally grown, bio, organic, fair trade, free range, grass-fed, like all of these different things that we have created, these different kinds of certifications we've created, are to make visible flows in other parts of the system, so that we can see that we are being a good person, or that we are taking care of the planet, and those kinds of things. And people will often shop different places, undergo inconveniences, and pay more, in other words, compromising some of the economic imperative, when they can see these other things present. And these other things are, in fact, anti-rival. They are for mutual benefit, as being described earlier, because they're positive externalities. Oops, apparently I was going to walk through those that way and didn't. So then let's dig just a little bit deeper into the concept of living systems wealth. We're very familiar with the current economy and the sort of gambling chips that dollars represent. Sorry, I'm realizing this may be in your way there again. And that's really a realm of speculative wealth. And obviously this has been a big thing in the crypto space, trying to have tokens that everybody's supposed to buy into because they're going to go to the moon. that tends to actually have a very extractive relationship to living systems wealth, because people keep trying to reduce things to this one-dimensional gambling value of price. And price tends to mask and cover up the effects of all the deeper relational integrity in the living system. So the next level that's actually part of the living system, because the current, so I'm using an ocean here as sort of the metaphor of the living system, and the current economy is like the dock extended into the ocean, but not really a part of the living system, right? It ends up having an extractive relationship. You could think of the people fishing off the pier there or something, because what they're fishing for is that tradable wealth. And this is actually, this and the speculative wealth is the only domains where scarcity applies. This is the domains where rivalry is at play. And it has to do with the level of parts and products of systems. So if we start expanding these levels of systems out to levels of properties of systems, like if we take the human body as an example, I'm just going to use the circulatory system and blood as the example here. You can sell plasma or platelets or donate blood. If maybe you've had a rare disease and developed antibodies for it, and you could actually sell those medically, this would be an example of parts and products in the most crude sense. I'm not talking about, extracting labor and skills or knowledge, but actually talking about physical body here as a living system. But then we have the property levels of systems, which has to do with, for example, your blood types. Your blood type. You can't trade blood types. You can measure blood types. And in fact, without measuring blood type, the tradable wealth would not be very valuable, because we could actually hurt people with the infusions of blood. And at that level, it's sufficiency that is at play. And Western science tends to like to expand to this level of measurement, but often has challenges expanding into the deeper dynamics of systems. And here, when we're dealing with the performance of systems, we actually have, we tend to compare things directly. Like think of Olympic athletes. They don't just get to email in their measures, their scores. We actually put them under the same conditions at the same altitude, run them on the track against each other at the same time to measure their performance, to compare their performance and rank them. The gold, silver, bronze are ranking, they're ordinal type of metrics. And here we're actually dealing with the vitality level of a living system. Again, all these dimensions of a living system are at play at the same time, and different currencies can reach and activate these different levels, similar to the way that they reach and activate those different domains of human motivation. In fact, very similar in that the speculative and tradable are using rational numbers, because they can actually be separated from the system and broken into parts. The measurable realm is using the sort of interval or whole numbers, right? You can't divide a blood type into subtypes exactly. There's still a even integer number of blood types, and performance level of systems is ordinal and relationship is nominal. And this would be the realm of nameable wealth, and it has to do with harmony or dynamics of systems, where here in the cardiovascular domain, it'd be like if you tried, trying to rank people. Oh, sorry, I skipped the performance level system. This would be like your blood pressure, which we tend to like to take a snapshot of and try to pretend that it's a static measure, but it isn't. It's dynamic. It changes. It can change 5 minutes later if you eat something salty or get angry. And then we keep moving out relationship level of systems. This is be like your cardiovascular health. And you can't really like line up a room of people by cardiovascular health, because there's too many competing dimensions. You might say, well, this person seems very fit, but, and has been training for a marathon, but it turns out they maybe have a family history of early heart failure. And, there's too many dimensions that you can't just rank them, and you actually have to start naming them. And because language is one of the tools that we use to be able to represent the relational levels of systems. And in fact, language itself is an example of something that emerges out of the realm of possible wealth. And it's part of what allows us to build the models and understanding that would allow us to change the dynamics of systems at all the other levels. So the evolutionary capacity system would be an example here of like being able to install pacemakers or do a heart valve transplant or things like that, or train for a marathon, or, you know, it actually activates the wealth at all of the other levels to have increases in your evolutionary capacity here. And so part of what this points to is that fiat currencies, because they are actually what fiat means, spoken into being from nothing, they actually have no inherent value. And the way that we've hacked creating their value is to make them artificially scarce. And hence we've encoded scarcity to value. And we actually have to recognize that scarcity and value are not the same thing. We need deeper models of value to be able to tap in to that, because we have to do things like understand that drinkable water and breathable air are valuable before they're scarce. We can't wait till they're scarce to recognize their value. So just one of the last things here is about accounting for a networked era. And I'm not sure how many people are familiar with REA accounting. It stands for Resources, Events, and Agents. And it's really about recording flows of resources as an economic event between responsible agents and holding them responsible. And this emerged in the 80s as a new accounting standard that's really, you can think of it as supply chain accounting or cross-organizational accounting, because the, you know, hundreds of years old practice that we're doing of double entry accounting is locked within the walls of a single organization for the double entries to take place. REA accounting has been an ISO standard for around 15 years. You can see the standard number there if you want to look it up, and I'll have a link at the end if you want to find that. And then there's an implementation of REA that we've built on Holochain. And Holochain, as Sonia mentioned, is not a blockchain. It's really a post-blockchain. It's scalable. It does not have a built-in token. We really view it as being able to run the next web and on Holochain. But HREA.io is an example of a project you can learn more about. It has a GraphQL API that's been implemented and is powered on Holochain, which allows it to be a completely neutral platform for a supply chain. Or if you think of like SAP as an enterprise resource planning system, it begins to become a network resource planning system for whole communities and networks, and can make flows visible to different levels of participation. It doesn't just automatically put everything in a public space. There's actually different layers of participation, because there's still some information that people consider competitive, that they don't want all their pricing to be visible to their competitors or things like that. And you notice this HREA logo looks a little bit like those food index systems there. And we're using the value flows ontology in HREA, and as we've said, has built on Holochain. And really, I think my time is up, and there is a page if people want to provide this. I think we've shared the link to this presentation with Sonia. If not, we will. There's links to all of these resources available.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Wow, it's so nice to be at a talk that literally it's mind expanding. And whenever I think that I'm challenging the orthodoxy, I realize that because I'm in the academy, my challenge of the orthodoxy is just minute compared to what some of you guys are doing. And I am so appreciative that we also recorded this talk. So hopefully you won't mind us sharing it in a bigger venue after, but we'll check with you. So now we open up for questions. And of course, I am moderating, so I'm just filled with questions that I could kick off, but I'm sure there's some questions maybe from the group here assembled, or maybe I'm going to start with a question while people start thinking of their own questions, unless I see a hand coming up really quickly. But well, you covered so much ground, and of course there's a lot of nuanced questions, like how you even came up with a slide that had the ocean as the background for all these different layers of value. Of course, it'd be interesting to know how even that kind of mapping of value came to you. But I think I have a much more basic question to start with, and it ties into your leading example of this kindergarten, where the parents, once they realized that they could leave the kids there for longer, then they didn't have to worry about all those the moral imperative, the appreciation imperative, the social imperative, the tribal, and the contribution imperative. But I'm wondering, one of the criticisms that we often hear is that when we turn things into fungible economic value, or when we have any way of having a currency system, that we would lose some of the types of value that we're trying to protect. And I'm inviting you, within the context of your whole discussion, how can we have a currency system that would obviously do some role of providing a metric or some kind of way of counting? How do we not lose the deeper value of the moral imperative, the appreciation imperative, the social imperative, et cetera? If you could just maybe start out with helping us understand that, because I'm sure we'll all try to incorporate it into our work.
Yeah, well, those imperatives, I think, are always present in terms of what motivates most people. And those levels of system health are always present in terms of living systems. And yet, as you're pointing to, when we tend to reduce things to money, when we start steering, I mean, if you think about it, price is a one-dimensional indicator. It can go up or it can go down. And what you need to understand the health of living systems is far deeper dimensionality than that. I mean, it's like, could you imagine going to a doctor who considered the only valuable, the only reasonable unit of measure to be meters or centimeters, millimeters, or, like, and everything else was considered noise? And the doctor may be very creative, may have ways that you can, jump into a tub to look at your body mass displacement of the water, or hang from a bar and measure in centimeters how far the bar bends, but not count kilograms, because that's not a valid measure. Only meters and subdivisions of meters. Like, that would be a weird thing. Like, because how could the doctor measure blood type? How could they measure, I don't know, cholesterol levels, or different things like that? There's many dimensions that matter that you just are never going to get to from centimeters. And really, that's what we end up doing with money. When we try to measure things in terms of its speculative value relative to markets being fueled by scarcity, that's a horrible tool to steer by for policymaking and for governance and for actually trying to create living systems. Like you mentioned Eleanor Ostrom's, patterns of commons management. None of that comes from the measuring only in terms of the extractive value, which is, when you measure only in terms of money, really what you end up getting. And so, even though all of these things exist and they pre-exist to money, money tends to mask them and hide them from us and cover them up. And culturally, when we start putting things in economic terms, we reduce things. We reduce all that deep dimensionality into just these one dimensions, and actually lose information and lose the feedback loops that give us the health of the systems we're trying to support. And so that's why people warn about the concern of putting in place currencies, because they think of them only as these monetary currencies. And as long as they are only these monetary currencies, they can't give us what we need. We need more.
So I guess because we have you here and you're a founder of HoloChain, so concretely, you spoke about the REA accounting, and you have the complex image, which I don't know if you want to show again, which showed all the value flows. But if we have the scheme of this REA accounting, and we have all of those diverse values. Can you just give us a concrete, how would we implement holochain to one concrete, like maybe the kindergarten, something? Can you walk us through how that could work so we can follow you in maybe even converting some of our aspects of our apps to holochain?
Sure. Let me just give the disclaimer, even though, yes, I'm trying to have holochain succeed in the world, it isn't a magic bullet. Just trying to convert something to holochain, if it's going to do the same thing, may or may not be worthwhile. What it does do is provide some neutrality, because it's completely peer-to-peer. Everybody hosts themselves, basically, and you point your browser at localhost, and then underneath that is a data coordination engine, that is managing the data integrity of the system, so that it doesn't matter that you host yourself. It's like that you can't tamper with the data. It ends up being still enforced. It has many of the guarantees of blockchain without the lockstep to a single threaded process that global consensus produces. So in the example of the daycare center in Israel, if they, who knows for sure, we haven't had the chance to do the experiment, but if they had taken a different approach, let's say they had created a social currency instead of an economic fine, they had put up a board and let's call it not a wall of a hall of fame, but a wall of shame, not with the intention to really produce shame, but to actually just show to the group, give themselves the feedback loop of who's showing up late, and they get little, I don't know, red stickers by the family's name or something like that. Now what you're actually amplifying there is the social imperative and the moral imperative, because you want to think of yourself well, but you also want to look good. But the other thing that it does is it creates a different feedback loop. Families may have no idea who's being fined for being late, but if they can see the other families being late, they don't know, they've picked up their kids and left, right? If they can see actually who may need support, then they have the opportunity to offer that support. They could say, hey, we don't live that far from you. We could pick up your kids, bring them with us. Why don't you pick them up at our house later, or something like that? You actually start activating more collective intelligence with that type of feedback loop. Now, I'm not saying it's the perfect answer in this solution, in this daycare center story, but it would have been a different approach, and I'm guessing would have been slightly more effective. And so you can do these kinds of things where you can set up feedback loops in non-economic dimensions so that you can start tapping in to greater levels of intelligence and behavior change and mutual support.
Okay, so I'm going to, because the spirit of this would be if all of the keynote speakers can give the presentations, and then we'll have time to generate a discussion. And I see that we're already getting some commentary on your presentation. We have hands now, but we only had enough time to just, can you keep your questions and then bring it in at the end, or contribute to them to the chat, because it's now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, who is Primavera de Filippi. And it's my great honor, and also to have another member of our advisory board here. So Primavera is a permanent researcher at the National Center of Scientific Research, CNRS in Paris, a faculty associate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet Society at Harvard University, and a visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman Center for the Advanced Studies of the European University Institute. And I also want to mention to you that Primavera has published 2 books: Copyright Law in the Digital Environment, Private Ordering and the Regulation of Digital Works, and now recently in 2019, Blockchain and Law, the Rule of Code. And so with that, I would like to turn over the floor to Primavera.
Hi, thank you. Today I will try to present a few examples of how blockchain technology can be used not only to create or exacerbate scarcity system, but rather to experiment with more common-based and ideally anti-rival economics. And so before being a blockchain scholar, I was an IP lawyer, IP scholar. So I was working a lot on copyright and patents and IP more generally. And I think all my life as a scholar, I've been exploring alternatives to IP, and but from like a legal perspective with like open source and Creative Commons and so forth. And then when I started doing my research on blockchain technology, I also started exploring ways in which we can use blockchain technology in order to create systems that nonetheless provide some kind of reward for creativity and innovation, but do not actually abide by the traditional rules of exclusivity and artificial scarcity that intellectual property provide. So I'm going to provide, three examples of three blockchain-based instances of how we can actually play around with a blockchain-based system in order to try and create different types of economic models, which promote creativity, but also that try to fight the rivalry that most tokenized systems are actually implementing. And so one is on patents, one is on copyright, and the third is more about realigning the value or realigning the value of NFTs together with the value of more environmental or more like social impact causes. So the first one is called Widia, which is about taking the I out of the inventor. So it's like collective ideas. And it's based on the premises that the patent system actually is created as a justification to create sufficient incentive for people to actually innovate. But in reality, the reason that we do need so many economic incentives to innovate is pretty much because of the patent system, which encourage competition and redundancy in the research and development, and actually adopting a model of incremental innovation and collaboration and cooperation might actually not require the patent system to incentivize innovation, because the cost of innovation becomes distributed amongst a much larger group of people. And so the idea here is to explore how we can use blockchain technologies as a way of actually fostering open and decentralized collaboration in the domain in which patent currently exists. So this is kind of the general overview of the Widia system. I'm going to go over it so that it becomes a little bit more clear, perhaps. But essentially, the idea is that people that have an idea might realize that maybe they have the idea, but they don't have the resources, they don't have the full knowledge, they don't have the funds to actually bring this idea to the point of actually being a patentable idea and potentially an industrial application. So those people that, and also those people might be interested in actually sharing this idea and actually getting many, many people to collaborate in order to improve the idea and potentially implement it. So, so those people that have those ideas and want to turn them into Widias, they can submit those ideas to the Widia DAO collective, whatever, which those ideas are then reviewed through a preliminary expert committee, and then they are peer reviewed through themselves, through the people that submitted into the same batch, up to the point in which we have a list of ranked ideas that the peer review process has declared could be interesting potential Widias. At this point, there is a preliminary period in which there needs to be a particular amount of funds that are committed to those Widias in order to deal with all the bureaucracy and logistics that involve pretty much the provisional patent application, the actual research and development in order to be able to reach a patentable invention, and then the process of patenting this invention, but also all the management fees and all the litigation fees that are collected in order to enforce the condition of the patents. And so people can submit funds in order to support those ideas, and there is like a particular threshold that is required in order for those ideas to actually be eligible to enter into the whole system of the WIDIA project. And then this is when collaborative research and development operates. So as soon as the threshold is reached, then the WIDIA DAO submits a provisional patent application, which means that now the idea that has been suggested can be publicly disclosed to the world at large, and no one can file a patent for a period, the grace period, which usually is about 12 months. And so now there is 12 months of time of collaborative effort in order to try and actually turn this idea into a patentable idea. And this idea can be both financial, and so people can contribute funds in order to support this endeavor. And in exchange of the funds that they provide, there is a decreasing amount of tokens that is given for the same amount of funds. So the earlier the people are contributing funds, the more tokens I will get for the same amount. At the same time, there might be a lot of different types of contribution, which are more in-kind contribution, which is people that are providing facilities, which are providing like some kind of resources, material resources, or perhaps just like intellectual work and so forth. And again, those people, as they contribute to fostering this idea into a more refined and patentable idea, they will be rewarded with tokens based on a particular governance structure that this WIDIA DAO has established for that particular project. Now, ideally, after 12 months of collaborative effort, we obtain a patentable idea, the patent is granted, and then instead of just having a patent that now we can exploit freely following a particular licensing scheme, all the ideas that have been created through the WIDIA system are put into the WIDIA patent pool. And the WIDIA patent pool comes with specific condition, which is all the patents are licensed under a defensive patent license, with additional condition where we implement the copyleft licensing system into the patent system, meaning that everyone can use the invention, but if on one of the inventions from the patent pool, then there's an obligation to actually put the new patent into the patent pool as well under the exact same condition in order to ensure that all the derivative and all the incremental innovation that emerge from the same invention is also licensing in an open manner, with the exception of commercial use. And commercial use comes with a particular condition. And so essentially what it means is that all the people that want to use the invention in a non-commercial, non-profit manner, they can use it absolutely without asking permission to anyone. Researchers and inventors that want to build upon those inventions can do it freely, with the obligation that if they choose to patent one of the derivative invention, then they have to put it back into the same patent pool. And the commercial user, the condition, so as opposed to the traditional patenting licensing system in which you need to contact the inventor and you need to obtain a licensing and you need to pay royalties every time you're actually using or profiting from the invention. Here, the condition is just that you need to stake a particular amount of tokens, right? So it's not really an expense, but you need to stake. So you need to block those tokens for the period of time in which you want to exploit commercially the invention. And so this means that all of a sudden you're creating a flow of economic returns because the commercial users need to acquire this particular amount of tokens. And so they can either acquire those tokens from the early contributors, from the funders, or from the in-kind contributors, which have accumulated tokens because they contributed collaboratively to the invention, and now they some money by selling those tokens to the commercial user, or the commercial user can also purchase it on the secondary market from other commercial users that might no longer be interested in using the invention, or simply because they are willing to pay a lot of money in order to obtain those tokens. But also there is a point, and this is very important because this is where the non-rivalry comes about, is there is a point in which perhaps there are not enough tokens in the market. And in this case, the commercial user can still purchase those tokens directly from the WIDEA DAO that has established the invention, according to a particular increasing bonding curve, meaning that the more tokens there are in circulation, the higher is the price of acquiring the next tokens. And so as long as the market price is lower than the bonding curve, then it's more convenient to buy it on the market. But there is a point in which there are too many people that want to exploit the invention and not enough tokens in the market, and therefore the market price of those tokens increase. And in this case, it might be more convenient to purchase it from the DAO. And so there is an infinity over time. And so essentially, we can see this as this kind of funnel where we throw in a lot of potential ideas and ideas into the top of the funnel. Once they pass the review, they get to the phase of like pre-funding, where people invest or commit a particular amount of resources because they believe this is worthy of a patent, of a open defensive patent. Once the patent is obtained, then the idea gets into the patent pool, and then now becomes free for everyone to exploit if there is no commercial or using the tokens. So here the interesting aspect is that this system encourages people to engage into this collaborative effort. And of course, there is still competing with existing proprietary model of patenting an invention. But the idea is that if this is something that actually people care about, if we're actually working on important invention that the world really wants to happen, this is possible to actually get a lot of contribution, financial or in kind, and efficient gravitational force, so that there is now $10 million that are into the funds for this particular idea. Then any competitor that doesn't have enough, that doesn't have $10 million on their own, will have an incentive to join. And so they will put their own $5 million into it, because rather than losing the patent race, they would rather share a portion of whatever this thing will actually obtain. And slowly the idea will be like, as this gravitational force increase, more and more actors realize that it's very hard to compete against this collaborative effort. And so joining the forces and actually putting even more resources into these funds, therefore attracting even more people to join the fund. And the idea is kind of to create like the same modality that Wikipedia has created, in which it becomes pretty much impossible to compete, to create a commercial proprietary encyclopedia that will compete with Wikipedia, because the whole world is actually supporting Wikipedia and no one has enough fundings to alone compete with this collaborative effort. So this is like the model for patents. Another one that I can briefly describe is the model for copyright. And so here the idea again is to try and show that NFTs, even though they have been oftentimes created as a source of scarcity and exclusivity, and actually taking artificial scarcity that is created by legal means and actually incarnating this artificial scarcity into a technical type of scarcity. This is just one way. This is the most popular way in which NFTs are being designed, but there is actually many other possible models that should still be explored and that can actually be used in order to incentivize collaboration, incentivize remix, and creating more access to creative works. And so the model of Remix NFT is essentially about, it has like 3 different layers. So the first one is, so you take an NFT, and this NFT is actually dual. So there is the NFT that is associated with the actual copy, the unique copy of the work, which is a standard NFT. But then every single work is also associated with a remix NFT, which gives the right to create a derivative work to that particular artworks. And this remix NFT, as opposed to being in a traditional market sense that anyone can sell it at a particular price, it's inherently on a perpetual auction, meaning that you don't choose how much you can sell it to. You also cannot hold on to it, because if anyone is willing to bid, to overbid, then they will obtain the remix NFT and they will also be able to create a remix. But of course, the more the work has been remixed, then the more expensive it becomes to create a remix. The reason this is interesting is because this creates an incentive to create as many remix as early as possible. And this created this kind of like mimetic encouragement to create like mimetic dissipation of those works, because if I know that the remix NFT will start costing a lot, then, and if I think that this work will be very popular, I might have an interest in actually creating a remix of this work. And my remix should be like as cool as possible, because the moment in which the original remix has reached a point that is like very expensive, then the second choice, people will look at the remix of the work in order to remix that remix, right? And that's how the mimetic things happen. And so when people see a work and they think like, wow, this work is really cool, I want to remix it, but also I want to be the remix that will be remixed afterwards. And so this creates like an incentive by publishing the work under this type of model. It's incentivizing people. It's an invitation, please remix my work as early and as much as possible, because then you will also become potentially remixed. And then there is all this system of royalties and attribution, which is actually one of the important problems that Creative Commons has, which is, on the one hand, it's very hard to maintain the attribution of who has remixed what and what is a derivative work of what, but also there is a problem in the economic model, because the way in which most Creative Commons artists actually acquire compensation is by creating restrictions for non-commercial, non-derivative, and so forth. So here there is an integrated mechanism that every time the remix of a particular work is being sold, the token is being purchased, or the NFT associated with that remix is being sold on the secondary market, there is automatically a dispatch of the funds that are redistributed to all the works that this remix has been derived on. And so if there is the remix of the remix of the remix, then the original work will also benefit from. And so again, there is an economic incentive now for the author of the original work to incentivize to the maximum the creation of derivative works. And so this is kind of like a little schematic things, but the benefit of this is that there is an incentive to actually maximize the visibility of the work, because the more visible the work is, the more likely people will want to remix it. It encourages the creation of derivative work and this mimetic evolution. It provides perfect traceability of who has remixed what and what, given one work, what it is based on, and then automatic economic rewards. And then finally, for the last 5 minutes, so this is a model, it's not really related with IP, but it is also a model of trying to present ways in which NFTs, the value of the NFTs can actually be associated not just with the market value, but actually with external, maybe more meaningful things, such as the vitality of environmental resources, or like education, or whatever one chooses to do. And so the idea with, so I'm going to use environment as an example, but it can be used for anything. So the idea is that you create an NFT, and this NFT is now associated inherently with particular data points that can be collected by oracles around, for instance, a particular location, a particular natural resources. So it can be like the water contamination of a river, it can be the ground fertility of a particular region, the deforestation, the biodiversity, and so forth. And then every NFT is also associated with a particular beneficiary, which will receive a portion of the sales. And these can be either a particular NGO or a particular group that is that is acting towards the preservation of those natural resources, or it can actually be the people that are the most affected by the degradation of the environmental resource. And so every time the NFT is being sold, there is a portion that goes to them. And the portion is actually not just a fixed there is an incentive to, as a collector, to ensure that the natural resource is as healthy as possible in order to benefit the most by actually selling this token. So the way it works is that once there is dynamic content, meaning that the vitality, the data collected by the oracle will dictate the looks of the NFT. And so the healthier is a particular natural resources, the more beautiful, the more colorful, whatever, the more higher quality will be the NFT, and vice versa. But also the tax that is taken every time the NFT is sold will depend on the vitality index, where the healthier is the resources, the lower is the tax, because the resources is fine, whereas the lower is the health of the resources, the higher is the tax, because people are being affected, and also because the NGO working on it needs more work in order to benefit. And so essentially the idea is also to create a collaborative effort, in the sense that imagine that we have like a PFP collection of like 10,000 NFTs, which are all associated with a particular area in a particular location that has like some environmental crisis perhaps. And so all the collectors of those NFTs, even though they are like individual speculators, all of a sudden they have an interest to coalesce and to actually collaborate. And if 10,000 people are investing $1,000 into a fund in order to preserve and to restore the vitality of these resources, then all of a sudden we have $10 million that can actually bring a change into the vitality index, and will, as a consequence, will actually enable them to earn much more than $1,000 by selling the NFT at a higher price because of the higher quality and because of the lower tax. And then finally, and so it's interesting also for like the metaverse, as like today we have like people buying and selling virtual lands for like creating this model into the metaverse. The visuals of the land depends on the actual vitality of a real resources in the interest in ensuring, for instance, that the biodiversity of the associated land is very good, because that will enable my metaverse parcel of land to look very good and therefore to be sold more expensively, but also the tax that will come with the sale of this land will be lower. And then finally, the last item is that once the vitality index of the resources goes below a particular threshold, then automatically this NFT will be expropriated. So the collector has lost the investment, because there is no way then he can recoup anything. And this creates this kind of interesting economic behavior of like kind of like the penny stock effect, as in like when you see that the resource is close to the threshold and therefore almost will be expropriated, people might be willing to sell it for very cheap, because it's better to sell it for very cheap than not to sell it at all. And this might enable those collectors that be like, okay, let's actually buy like thousands of those NFT for like very, very cheap price, and then let's invest a lot of money, or like a few $100,000 or $1 million into boosting the vitality of resources in order to then be able to profit the creation of the NFT that I bought. It enables to create these new types of, on the one hand, profit-driven philanthropy, meaning that a lot of people are willing to actually donate in order to help the environment. But here, in addition to donating and therefore doing the philanthropic act, they can also have an expectation of profit if the philanthropy that they have done is actually successful, and vice versa. It also enables speculators to also feel better, because they are speculating, but they are also speculating towards the preservation or the environmental resources, where the value of their investment is inherently dependent on the value of that. And so there is an alignment of interest between the private economic interest of the speculators and the actual interest of the nature or of the resources or of the data points that the NFTs has been associated with. So yeah, so those are like 3 examples, I think, of interesting models where blockchain-based system can be implemented in a more original and creative way in order to experiment with new economics and potentially like removing the artificial scarcity of IP, but also modifying the notion of value to be more associated with real world value as opposed to just speculative market value.
Thank you, Primavera. Again, I'm just astonished by the richness of that. Having you from the board here is just, finally we hear you speak instead of us telling you about ATARCA. So do I have one question from the audience for Primavera? Where just to stay on schedule, I'm going to ask if there's one. I hate to be the one that's always asked. Okay, so we have one from Tommy, so I'll let Tommy, the floor is yours for your question.
Okay, so as far as I understood, this was generally about licensing and licenses and combining them with the blockchain or DLT-based approach in this anti-rival, non-rival context. But have you given a thought about these CC licenses and combining them with the approach you have here?
Have I given a thought about what?
Creative Commons licenses, which are currently manually sort of propagated.
Yeah. So actually, we created in order to enable the remix NFT model to exist, most notably, we created a new license which we just released like a few weeks ago, actually, which is actually inspired from Creative Commons and but comes with a interesting legal innovation, because the main problem today is like, how do we license IP via a token that is constantly transferred from one person to another? And most licensing schemes are based on a personal license, meaning that I license to you, but then if you want to switch the license, either I need to give you the right of sub-licensing, or I need to recreate a license with the new person. The Creative Commons and GPL model are very interesting because they do not rely on personal licenses, they rely on public licenses. But we also don't want to make a public licenses because we want to make it conditional to token holders. And so we created this new token-bound license, which comes with this kind of dual licensing system, where you have the work that is licensed under a traditional Creative Commons work, but with specific restrictions. And then a secondary public, but conditional public license, which is also to the world at large. So it's not personal, but the condition to benefit from the terms of the public license is that you actually you're currently in possession of a particular token, which represent the remix NFT in this case. And in this case, you actually get the benefit of the license follows the token. And so it's kind of a remix of the Creative Commons licenses to apply it to an NFT systems. And all the challenges, all the legal uncertainty that comes with like sub-licensing, all this thing is completely eliminated by just introducing this legal innovation.
Oh, that was a great question, a great answer. I'm going to jump in just because we're going to hope to have a bit of a discussion at the end. And I want to make sure that we give enough time then for our next speaker, Michael Zargam, who's also on our board of advisors and who is part of the Stanford DAO Symposium. He is the founder and chief engineer of BlockScience and a core member of the Meta Governance Project. He holds a PhD in electrical and systems engineering from the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied optical resource allocation and policies and networks. His ongoing work focuses on engineering best practices in estimation, decision control. And so I'm going to be turning over the floor now to you, Michael, and just remember everybody stay on because we're hoping to then have that final discussion with all the speakers. So the floor is yours, Michael. Welcome.
Great. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. I'm coming to you from ETH Denver. Actually, we just wrapped up a bunch of sessions on decentralized science, and as a result, I'm going to be talking about that today. Go to the beginning of my slides here. Cool. So, as Primavera indicated, actually, sort of scientific research is actually pretty naturally anti-rival, and that the sort of institutions around it largely would have produced a rivalrous-like nature. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can sort of work backwards through data, and particular attribution networks to produce a more anti-rival experience in research. So the first thing is I'm going to sort of remind us that, like, there are these rich attribution networks. Historically, this is bibliometrics, which is pretty shallow. To Art's point, if we measure just citation counts, then that's a shallow measurement, maybe not going to get all the way to the real value being created by research. And so we are going to need to find ways to move deeper into the representation of research. But at first blush, it's easy to see how interconnected and sort of co-beneficial building on each other's research is. I've seen this also emerging in Web3, and this is from a few years ago, but some of the earliest efforts in the blockchain context or within communities working on blockchain to produce attribution networks came from a project called SourceCred, which started using indexing richer data from things like GitHub repos and other sources to actually build networks of related work. And so you can start to see the existence of both artifacts, sort of events that produce artifacts, as well as the people engaged in those events and the production of those artifacts viewed as a network. And in particular, these networks have rich metadata. So, that basically means that we know more about these things than just like sort of their name and authors. We could have detailed information about the nature of the contribution, whether it's software, whether it's research. The idea here being that we can build up a model of co-value creation that's not limited to things that can be directly measured. In particular, the types of labor that are usually least well measured are the ones that produce the least artifacts, which often means like support labor and other types of contributions that are enabling of maybe the more artifact producing contributions. And so some work I did a few years ago was looking at how to generalize these patterns. So like general attribution networks where we're going to try to produce data, and that data in particular needs to be capable of being a good representation of the real activities. And since we don't want to make strong assumptions about those activities, we're really focused on how the information can be structured at sort of a meta level. So titles, identifiers. In this example, we talk about using something like a checksum or a content address for a piece of software as well, to ensure that there's some consistency in the software that wrote the records. We also had some notions of typing, but particularly relevant here is the fact that you're creating parent relationships. So you're pointing back to previous events within this attribution graph, and then you have sort of detailed data or nested structures that allow you to do more. By building out sort of this sort of network ontology for what I call sort of attribution networks, or more recently contribution graphs, we can sort of blend over a wide range of different implementations and help them sort of interweave over time. And in particular, this is because there are lots of different projects working on different types of, contribution tracking and or attribution giving. And what we don't want is for those systems to be siloed away from each other. We want a framework in which they can build upon each other, reference each other, and improve in general. And so I'll come back around to some more recent work in this area, but I think I want to connect this back into the discussion of rival versus anti-rival goods. And I think Primavera did a great job sort of articulating the way the intellectual property law encloses what would be otherwise non-excludable goods. And in particular, there's a very big shift from anti-rival to rival when we look at the way sort of open source versus closed source, say, software development works, right? You have an environment in which the open source development fosters kind of this continuous expansion and building upon and learning from each other. Whereas if you are sort of keeping things private, you're using that as a means of securing the rights to monetize things. And in a case where you're optimizing for financial returns, it's plausible that that's going to be better for you individually, but it's certainly not going to be better for sort of the public at large, because we are suppressing this feedback loop with this sort of recursive production. So I've been really interested in the question of decentralized science for some time, but I also think it's important to break it down and understand the kinds of contributions that are sort of pursuant to a successful kind of co-production of new ideas. And that means that we have to be able to identify what areas are promising directions for future research, create incentives to pursue those research directions. That currently involves mostly grants coming from centralized institutions. Enabling coordination amongst researchers is something that particular fields do often. So your department or the others within your academic sector are going to be people that you meet up with at your regular conferences, and that will facilitate some coordination. We have the actual research artifact production. That's not necessarily the legible artifacts, right? It's a different piece of work to turn your research into something that someone else can consume, apply, cite, etc. As the body of research rises, there's a lot of work to potentially organize, curate. This can include peer review and selection into journals. It can also include what gets distributed as like a recommendation to apply in a particular like sort of real world case. And in particular, I'm interested in this question of how do we create the adoption and legitimacy for new ideas, especially if those new ideas are actually coming out of sort of new institutional patterns or new behavioral patterns. I've noticed this, that I think the biggest challenge for the emerging sort of decentralized science movement, which I just take to mean that we're including a much larger group of researchers in our notion of what is scientific research, not excluding people who are sort of autodidacts or building in alternative organizations in our model of scientific production. And so building legitimacy for scientific work is actually quite hard, and it's historically a role filled by centralized institutions. And one of the ideas of the sort of adoption of Web3 technologies, or at least sort of rich sort of participatory technical infrastructures enabling the tracking of the attributing to sort of peer reviewing of this various research products, is that we can sort of unbind some of this bottleneck around creating this intellectual legitimacy and ultimately this adoption of these new technologies by having a more also called a more open, ideally more self-perpetuating system of identifying and applying new research. And so I tend to like this splitting between what's true and what's truthy, because what's often the case is that things that feel true get a lot more attention and more application, certainly use when it comes to policy making, versus things that we could say are true in the sense of scientifically sound. And it's a particularly common that new ideas are not truthy, that they're not yet adopted into the common sort of what is accepted to be true. And that doesn't make them false. It just means that there's a different piece of work to try to bring them up onto the diagonal of this axis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some sort of alternative scientific organizations that I'm involved in. I'm the founder of BlockScience, which we sort of envision as a digital civil engineering firm, and we do both basic and applied work. And I'm a research director and a board member, along with Primavera, actually, at MetaGov, which is a skunk works and a knowledge commons focused on governing digital spaces. So I'll talk briefly about those organizations. MetaGov's organizational structure is basically one where we have three pillars. We've got our operations, which sort of provides the functions that keep the research organization running. We have a community or breadth first group, and we have research activities, which are sort of depth first. And part of the reason I bring it up here is because it's sort of inclusive in nature, but without necessarily blending the more traditional academic research exercises, with the more community-focused research exercises. Those things can inform each other. You can create sort of a productive research and development environment and help bubble up the contributions of people who are maybe not necessarily traditional researchers, while also making space for people who are more traditional researchers to sort of work together and dive into their field. One of the aspects of this, one of the particular things that I wanted to bring up, though, was this thing GovBase, which is the sort of the database containing a wide range of the data that is generated by this community and makes it sort of legible and accessible. This is sort of open source data. Anyone can access it, learn on it, learn from it, build on it. And so this particular screenshot is from one of the many tables, and it focuses on constitutions that have been sort of found in the world and sort of documented and made legible and comparable, with a focus here on DAOs and decentralized organizations. But there's also data about traditional organizations here, and it actually facilitates comparison. I'm going to sort of jump on to talk about BlockScience, because I think in particular, I want to talk about the relationship between rival and anti-rival goods, which is something that we actually discuss internally. So our overall organizational architecture is mostly sort of sociocratic, in the sense that we have a bunch of different circles that fulfill different functions. We have to do operations. We have sort of basic research. We do projects that are applied research and generate funds. And we have communications, which relates to our, both our sort of brand and reputation in the market, but also the production of legible deliverables that help leverage the research that we've done. The reason why I am particularly interested in talking about this is that we have a sort of internal model of the resource flows. And what I find interesting is that we have these essentially resources that are consumed or exhausted when you use them, like money, like funded projects. You complete a funded project and it's done. Opportunities or leads. Again, when you resolve a lead, you either get a project or you don't, and it's gone. These are things that deplete when you operate on them. But we actually also have knowledge, skills, methods, and tools which are accumulating, right? Even within this organization, we can start to see this process of, scientific research as an anti-rival good, because the more of it we do, the more expertise, knowledge, methods, et cetera, of tools we build, the more we can build on those things, and they're not depleted when we leverage them to build the next thing. Similarly, in building brand reputation, partnerships, and relationships, it's generally the more that you make use of those things, in at least in a good faith way, the more that they expand. And so the things that are anti-rival effectively become the engines of the economic health of the organization in the long term, just even when there's a very real presence of rival resources within the flow. And so then we can look at the way that our various functions that were outlined in the previous diagram, the ones that the team works together to accomplish, actually sort of convert resources and flows. And in fact, we take a very sort of like biologic analogy for our organization. So it's very appreciative of art's articulation of value. And so we actually try to optimize for the creation of new ideas and the application of those ideas to bring about outcomes in the world, hence the digital civil engineering moniker. But I think that it's actually extra important from an organizational design and analysis perspective to recognize that this system is comprised of both rival and anti-rival resources, and that to be successful means to really recognize that you want to integrate, build up the things that are anti-rival, and that you just need to sort of have enough to get by on the things that are rival. You don't need to make those numbers go up infinitely. You just need to not run out, and you can make the anti-rival things really the values, the resources that you want to sort of drive in the long run. I'm going to move towards wrapping up, but I want to sort of highlight the fact that it's not about these organizations in particular. I've been looking and thinking about how these systems become networked and how the data becomes sort of entangled across the productive research work of many different organizations. And so I'm going to grab a sort of local neighborhood of my work and say, I've been lucky enough to do some research and ongoing discussions with members of the network goods team at Protocol Labs who are working on things like hypercerts for impact measurement, research roadmaps, or tech trees, which both actually fit within this graph ontology that I sort of introduced at the beginning. There's work from the Active Inference Institute on ontologies for decentralized research team and or epistemic commons. There's work-specific research projects at BlockScience around knowledge representation and knowledge management, something called our KMS project, as well as richer tooling for data supply chain. So insofar as these are sort of scientific exercises using software, being able to look at the way the inputs of one piece of software become, the outputs of one piece of software, one software process become the inputs of the next one, and actually building similar sort of relational trees when the artifacts are themselves pieces of software. The Govern project, for which I'm sort of advising and collaborating on some contribution reporting with another MetaGov research director, is working on mechanisms for self-reporting contributions within DAOs and in other types of organizations, and includes the ability to continue to capture data even as the schemas for reporting data evolve over time. And MetaGov is broadly interested in the governance of digital spaces. And it's my opinion that this network of records or data about the research contributions in many formats, and as well as the impact of those research contributions in many different applications, is essentially a digital space. In fact, I think of it as a kind of virtual data lake, and not in the sense that we should build a data lake, but in the sense that if we have a shared set of protocols for how we create these metadata records and pointers back to these research objects, that we can assemble them into this large graph that you can actually navigate. You can be in a neighborhood and you can move through it and find other things of interest and tie them together. And in particular, this relates to this idea of NFTs that are shareable, because the way this would happen is you would imagine each of these individual instances or packets of data about an activity, a contribution, an artifact, as being a bit like an NFT, and that as you build this up, you're never actually transferring them. You're just assembling a larger and larger network of related production, and that becomes the data over which maybe other types of reward schemes could be computed. And the hypercerts and some of the other impact measurement tooling would look at ways to do retroactive funding, for example, to reward people based on their contributions by sort of tracing back through the graph to find some of the critical insights that potentially, or critical applications that led to outcomes that many people shared. But the idea would be to shift away from a scarcity-based ontology for research or a scarcity-based ontology for expertise towards one where we can sort of value this like complex collaborative or contribution network that gives rise to innovation. But again, not with the sense that we should just throw away all of that information. I'm sure there's a non-trivial topology that makes up the relationships between all that work. And we want to make that measurement somewhat more valid and a little less reductive, so that value can emerge, and that the credit and funding and support get distributed more widely to try to produce a more effective feedback loop, like feed forward, to create more value, but also to make sure that the representations are not just reduced to things like citation counts or total grants received or what institution you're associated with. So I'll leave off with a sort of little local network around my work in this area. I have I'm working at BlockScience and to some extent with MetaGov here. With MetaGov, we're doing a little bit of research collaboration with Govern. With BlockScience, we're doing some collaborations with Protocol Labs, and with both BlockScience and MetaGov have connections to folks at the Active Inference Institute who are working on some of this epistemic commons, as it were. And that in particular is work, I think, being pushed by Daniel Friedman. And so that's what I have for you guys today. Tried to take a slightly different perspective on the research science sort of IP problem from Primavera.
Thank you for that invitation to leap also into this alternative world. So as the moderator, I'm just struck by the presentations, Arthur and Primavera and Michael Zargam, how this new world seems not just beckoning, but that it's already arrived and that we can potentially plunge in it and live it, not just as a research project. So there is time to ask a couple questions just directed toward this talk for a second. If there's any questions before then we open and have a general discussion. And if it's just one or two, I can always leap in with my own question. I don't see a hand immediately going up. So, and is there anything coming in? Oh, there's a chat question. So this is a question in the chat from Tommy. How do you see your figure truth versus truthy with regards to the current and still amplifying legitimacy crisis? Yeah, that's a really nice question. So why don't we pose that one?
Yeah, so in fact, that's sort of the source of that idea. So I sometimes refer to that as the Colbert axis, because he quoted the term, or he coined the term truthy as basically something that feels true rather than something that is true. And I generally attribute that to sort of marketers and politicians, and they often, in my mind, sort of pollute the information space by providing things that are truthy but not true. Like, there's nothing wrong with truthiness. It's actually quite important to get to a place where things feel true. But when you sort of exploit the fact that something feels true when it's actually false, or in some cases like directly misleading, then that's extremely problematic. And so part of the reason that we have, institutions that produce sort of legitimacy for ideas is to actually help filter and sense make the noise out. And I think that in our current stage, the media, particularly the mainstream media, has, as well as sort of social media, peer production, has created such a noisy environment that it's actually quite difficult to tell sort of the truthy from the true. And so, one way to interpret my talk is to say that, we sort of had this sort of media level decentralization where, like, sort of basically everybody's acting as a journalist, and we had a lot of noise and issues. We have, similar evolution potentially occurring in a scientific standpoint where everybody is capable of producing, but that also creates lots of noise, and everyone's going to be starting to say, hey, my thing's the new thing. And so, what I'm actually emphasizing with these data systems, attribution networks, rich metadata and contribution graphs, et cetera, is that we actually need a sort of socio-technical apparatus to help achieve that sense making. It's not suffice for us to say everyone's a scientist now. We have to actually create, I guess, what I would call like a neo academia, or a new set of processes that allow us to sort of sift through that, make sense of it, and kind of distill the true from the truthy.
Yeah, and we need to be fast about it. So yeah, thanks.
So is there another question directed to Michael? And then I guess my question would be, you have the last slide where you have all of the different organizations that you're involved in. And I'm wondering, from the view of being on the periphery to being dead in the center of the mainstream, where everything just is completely accepted, what is the state of acceptance, do you think, of the different projects that you're involved in moving toward the mainstream?
That's a good question. So let me first highlight the fact that, like, I never really understood the nature of the, let's say, the legitimacy through institutions until I ceased to have like a well-known institution as my like my home base. So, and I went to Dartmouth I have 2 degrees from Dartmouth and 2 from Penn. I worked with a lot of great people, and I always just sort of had this pass through where, like, if I wrote something, people read it and they wanted to talk about it, et cetera. And so then, I went into the industry for a couple of years, kind of got my hands particularly dirty building some pretty complex data systems, business decision making, et cetera. Kind of got frustrated with the way all the brain power was being fed into some things that I just didn't think were the right things for people to be focused on, and sort of, kind of broke out, founded BlockScience, and got more involved in what I thought was important research. But the observation was that once I didn't have those affiliations, I had to work a lot harder to get people to pay attention to what I was writing, even though I would argue the quality had improved. I had continued to do research. It was actually more grounded, et cetera. And so, some of these organizations, then they exist to kind of create their intellectual legitimacy for their participants. I think MetaGov in particular has been a great organization for building bridges between the traditional seen as legitimate institutions and people who are coming from a mix of backgrounds. I think BlockScience itself, I don't know, I think it's still pretty small. I want to keep it pretty small. So I'm not sure whether it will ever really fulfill that function of, creating a sort of source of legitimacy through its name. But I will say that the Protocol Labs team, in particular their network goods team, which is run by my friend Evan Miyazano, who has a PhD from Stanford, I think he's done an increasingly good job sort of positioning Protocol Labs to be to provide some intellectual legitimacy. They have quite a large array of research. It remains to be seen how lasting that is. And then some of the other organizations are quite small. The Active Inference Institute is pretty nascent. I'm on the Scientific Advisory Council. Similarly, Govern, I'm not sure that there will ever be like themselves a source of legitimacy. In fact, I would argue that success for them looks like their tooling getting integrated with more organizations, and that hopefully those organizations will produce, at least locally amongst their own communities, sort of trust in the information that they produce. So I guess maybe the big takeaway is that it's not that I think we should try to make the new institutions into the same big kind of clearinghouses of legitimacy. It's just that I'd like to see a more networked, more localized notion of scientific legitimacy. And in particular, I think this will help with ensuring that knowledge is localized. That might not sound totally clear, but like when we talk about trying to solve big problems like, social and environmental sustainability, a lot of the times the most relevant information is on the ground in the places that it's being applied. And there can be some issues if you're appealing to, authorities half a world away. Certainly you might need some important theoretical information that's generated by researchers in general, but you can't diminish or displace the value of the on-the-ground knowledge. And so a more distributed or more networked view of the like sort of scientific or intellectual legitimacy could go a long way to help reconnect our theories to our practices.
So that really resonates with what you began by saying about institutional backing and support. But that's really interesting to think through your own path, so that to be in the places where there's relative degrees of acceptance and locality can be really important. So now, as moderator, what I would like to do is open up the discussion. I think maybe it would be good to take a few questions and have them be directed at both the remaining speakers, now being Arthur and Michael. And we have the earlier question from Esko, if I can quickly re-find it, that was typed in. I just had it. Maybe Esko, I should just invite you to read it because, here, I can, Esko.
Sure. However, so yeah, hi Zargam as well, and hi Arthur. So thanks for your excellent presentations. And one thing I kind of wondered, and maybe this is something, let's say a discussion piece among you two, since I'm curious to see how, Arthur, since you started from saying that this is like our currency systems, they are more like on the really top level corner of your ocean figure. So it's like a really small piece of the value in really broad terms. And I'm really curious, since this is something that the European Commission is really kind of pushing us to do in this project. So how to combine the kind of intangible social elements of the value and make them kind of represented in the systems that we are kind of used to trading with and kind of accounting with. And this is also a kind of, since Zargam, you had in your presentation this figure, it's kind of combining these elements, but how do you feel about this? So can we combine those different elements of value in general? And if yes, what are the best practices to kind of move forward in this area?
Okay, so I'm gonna, well, go ahead and answer. And but
No, go
keep
ahead.
thinking and raise your hands so that I know if there's more questions and write in the chat. Thanks, everyone, and I'll just let Arthur go.
Great. When you say, when your question that you wrote on here is like, can those dimensions of social value actually be integrated or connected in with traditional currencies? And for me, it sort of depends on what you mean by traditional currency. In one sense, if we're talking about fiat national currencies, my answer is probably not. However, if you just mean monetary currencies, can we make new monetary currencies that actually integrate these things in? I would say yes, that is possible. And let me just give an example by extension. And I'm going to speak in US dollar terms just because I know the structure and relationships better than for euro and that kind of thing. But you could argue that dollars operate in tandem with a reputation currency called your credit rating. A credit rating is a kind of social currency. It is unfortunately largely measured only by some financial performance metrics, paying bills on time and your available credit to versus used credit, overall credit ratio, and there's a whole bunch of those kinds of things, which in some ways is good that it's very tangible. You know what they are. You could target those behaviors and numbers to increase your credit rating, but the credit rating actually affects the cost and availability of dollars. It affects interest rates you can borrow at. It affects transaction fees that are available to you, and that kind of thing. Now, if we were to extend that notion a little bit, and probably governments aren't ready to do this yet, but this might be able to be done at local levels and provide an example that maybe governments could adopt later. If you think about something like triple bottom line accounting, that's attempting to measure externalities in different domains, while it's a good idea or sort of like a noble idea, it's also in some ways fundamentally impossible. It's impossible for an entity to internalize all of the complexity of its external effects, because there's, in some ways, that's an infinitely complex domain, and you always, so because that's fundamentally impossible, you always shortcut it, and you become selective, and you become selective based on your own bias of what's going to make you look good, and so you're basically not getting very good data. But there's no reason why you couldn't build external feedback loops for externalities and build them into the currency. So if you think about dollars functioning with the credit rating, these two currencies, well, imagine instead the credit rating being like a triple credit rating, right? Having it actually be connected to, yes, your financial performance, your profit line, if you will. We've got those 3 Ps, profit, planet, and people, right? So, but then also your impact and actual ratings from people, from employees and vendors and community and that kind of thing. So you have an external feedback happening. It's not your job internally to integrate all of that complexity. And then the planet ratings, again, some through external feedback, like your actual consumption of resources and energy, your actual output of pollutants, but also data collected by potentially like environmental watchdog groups and that kind of thing that are tracking different things. Again, external feedback, and actually creates a market for those environmental feedback, for those environmental groups to be a part of the feedback loop and everything. Now imagine you were able to change some of the knobs and dials, the settings of knobs and dials in the monetary currency based on that triple credit rating. So the profit one could still determine how much you could borrow. The people one could basically determine the interest rate at which you borrow. In other words, there could be businesses that could literally borrow at a negative interest rate. We want you to borrow money to grow the impact of what you're doing because it has such positive externalities, right? And then the planet rating could be tied to transaction fees, for example. If you are making a mess, every time you touch money, we charge you because we have to clean up after you, right? And now you start having the kinds of feedback loops in a more kind of traditional monetary system, except it's not just the traditional monetary system, right? It is a new one that is building in some of these feedback loops. So, but it can look very traditional because when you tell the story about credit ratings, people are like, oh yeah, this is just a slight extension of something we know. So that's how I would answer that question with that kind of example.
I want to offer like a kind of sort of conceptual framework for doing what Art's talking about in a broad sense. So I use 3 layers. It's basically ontology, policy, and experience. And so we're talking about extending the ontology to include stuff that's not in the quote traditional ontology. And so it might seem like a minor change when we talk about this, like, oh, what if we include these extra concepts in our credit rating? But like those concepts are not in our data model. Like people are not measuring them. They're not being measured in a way that they can be made policy on, you can make policy against. And so then when we talk about like having different credit ratings depending on these different factors, that's policy. But like you can't make that policy if the concepts you're making the policy about aren't in your ontology. And so then, of course, the idea would be that those changes in ontology and thus policy drive changes in experience. And that can be experience at the level of an individual, could also be experience at the level of the whole system being healthier. But the reason why I think these new technologies are so important is because they're A, inviting us to rethink our ontologies, and B, providing us tools that allow us to actually account for richer ontologies. Again, like actually making it implementable to have these kind of external feedback loops that Art is talking about. Because I would argue that to some extent, the traditional system, as we've been discussing it, the fiat system, it's derived of the tools of the time it was made. And so it's sort of entrenched. It's just the way things are. And we need to take these opportunities with shifts in technical affordances to actually rethink these ontologies and actually provide the affordances required to incorporate these additional concepts in our accounting, and thus make policies that leverage those concepts, and in the end drive a change in experience for for individual people, but even for large societies and the planet.
Wow. So we're back to these accounting standards, and that there's already been work to extend and expand those standards. And it does seem that with whether it's the triple bottom line, or which wasn't sufficient, or moving into the different functionalities of holochain or distributed ledger blockchain, that we are able to expand our civilizational ability to capture value. I have a pretty selfish question I'm going to be answering because it's directly related to where Food Futures is a bit stuck, at least on convincing people we're on the right track. And I don't see any hands, so I'm really going to indulge here. So we're using Ostrom's work, and Ostrom focuses on common pool resources. And by definition, a common pool resource is like the fish in the ocean where they're scarce. And what we're trying to do in Food Futures with a big theoretical infrastructure is to say that if you use common pool resources in a sustainable way, like the atmospheric commons with that carbon dioxide, that even though it looks like it's a common pool resource that would be excludable and scarce, like how many kilograms of CO2 we can all put in the atmosphere, how can we reframe that so people could definitely think of, for example, environmental security, or every act of positive externality toward living the 1.5 Celsius degree lifestyle? How could it become just a no-brainer that we can achieve positive sum environmental security, and that is not a common pool negative sum project, but that it's a anti-rival positive sum environmental security project? So either of you, from all of your broad kens of experience with these different ways of accounting and having currencies, how could we make it easy for people to reconceptualize the atmosphere as something that's positive sum versus negative sum?
So this might be like less fun, but I think the truth is that like there are fundamental constraints in our environment. And so like it can be convenient and fun to sort of imagine like perfect abundance. I'd certainly like to identify where things are abundant and what we can do to make anti-rival processes run. But if you noticed in even the discussion of my own organization, I broke down the facets that were sort of constrained and separated them from the facets that weren't, and then tried to create like a healthy organic flow between them that is sustainable. And so when we talk about the environment in particular, I think it's important to remember that like some of the resources do have constraints. And so success for me, at least, looks like understanding the relationships between the rival and anti-rival, the sort of excludable and the non-excludable resources, and then taking seriously the differences in the kinds of relations that we should have between them. And then if the idea is to make it easy for people, well, that may just be that we are building new kinds of institutions that respect these relations in such a way that the natural practice that the behavioral norms produce, the natural practice that the accounting standards produce, et cetera, sort of makes the natural behavior the behavior that is effective from a sustainability standpoint. But I don't think that we can accomplish that by sort of removing constraints that are just part of the natural world. All living and biological systems do work with constrained resources, energy, nutrients, et cetera. They just sort of exchange them in a more symbiotic way.
Okay. Arthur, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I would just springboard straight from what Zargam was completing with about the constraints of natural systems. They do have constraints. You actually have to be connected to those constraints. And one of the problems with fiat currencies is that they're not connected. We can keep creating an infinite amount. There's no connection between the currency and the carrying capacity of the system that the currency is operating inside of. Now, it doesn't mean that it isn't possible to create currencies where there is that connection. In fact, it is possible, but probably not through fiat currencies. And one of the weird things is that, like, actually, if you go and look up the Wikipedia entry for fiat currencies, people are like, well, why is this a special kind of currency? All currencies are fiat currencies, which is not true, but it's like so occupies the mental space of our imagination. If you go to the talk page on Wikipedia is what I'm actually referring to, and I put a typology on there suggesting some other things. There's other forms of issuance. Fiat is just a form of issuance. My preferred form of issuance from a technical perspective is mutual credit, which is sort of like a variant of double entry accounting. Nothing is ever created from nothing. There's always offsetting entries, positive, negative entries. If I'm sending Zargam 100 credits, I go down 100, he goes up 100. But we can issue new currencies by me having a credit limit, by me being able to go into the negative that 100, and he goes into the positive. So one of the things that's interesting about mutual credit currencies is the net supply is always zero. So they're actually anti-inflationary because there isn't some big supply of it. There's always people who owe that value back into the system for what has been created. And it becomes a game of managing credit limits. And you can tie credit limits to other types of constraints. You can tie them to actual economic activity or resource availability or, let's stick with those two for the moment. So for example, holofuel, which is a currency we created for the Holo hosting network, which is Holochain does not have a currency. We mentioned that it's not a blockchain. It does not have a built-in token, but it does have a channel for being able to be served to mainstream web users. That's the Holo hosting network. So we created a currency for that. We've also worked with Zargam and BlockScience on some analysis and confirmation of our assumptions and design there, by the way. It is tied to the actual capacity, like the hosts providing hosting service, they start to earn a credit limit based on their hosting history. And so it's a resource-backed currency in that it's backed by hosting, and its supply grows as the demand for it grows, and it actually shrinks as the demand for it shrinks. So it actually is a breathing kind of dynamic supply instead of on this kind of exponential growth curve that interest-driven fiat based currencies puts us on, with no
So
healthy feedback loops.
I'm going to jump in because we're actually at 5:01, which I'll take as a sign that this was a really discussion that just could keep going and going. But technically, we do end right at 5, and we've been so fortunate to have Zargam, Filippi, Primavera de Filippi, and also Arthur Brock. So I didn't really get the opportunity to thank everybody properly for being here. So now I would like us to take that opportunity to really acknowledge that this has been an amazing session, given the quality of your contributions. So thank you, Zargam, and thank you, Arthur. And I hope we can all join in to that general applause that we can't really give very easily on Zoom. If anybody did want to stay over, but I know that our speakers may have to go to other venues. So I'm really glad that I was able to host this, and I think we should close. We'll be in touch with the speakers to see if we can use your content online, but we'll let you know that we're requesting and ask you for slides if you're happy to share them, but we can follow up with that later. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for an excellent session.